Hello, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined once again by my good friend Stephen Erikson, and we are going to have a look at chapter 19 of Midnight Tides. And it is a scene involving Rhulad and Udinaas. So that's the scene that we're going to talk about now. So before we get started, Steve, hi, how you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
I am very well. A lot of YouTube been going on recently. The Malaz scene is certainly busy,
Very busy. I can't keep up, actually.
but it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of interest, and uh, to be honest, it's one of the great things is these videos when they go up, I don't have to watch them straight away. I can watch them when I have time, and when I first read this series, there was so little in terms of things that you could look up, things you could consult, and this just seems to be like in comparison is a massive wealth, an
Yeah.
explosion of information. But if you think of how long these books have been out, it's a drop in the ocean.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, yeah, the readership for the Malazan stuff is never going to sort of reach those sort of those heights that you've got with other fantasy authors, and I've sort of come to accept that long ago. So yeah, I know. I always had a sense that various choices that I was making and what Cam and I were making was just sort of dropping people away one by one. So yeah.
But I suppose, the publishing industry is very much balancing between something that has to be, in some respects, a commercial success, because otherwise a publishing house is not going to buy it, but also in tune with your artistic desire for the literature. Literature is art. There is a story that you want to tell in a certain way. And that always has to be balanced. And whether you balance it more toward the bigger commercial audience or more toward being true to an artistic vision, that's a decision every author has to make, I think.
Yeah. And at the same time, it's almost not a choice. A writer is driven to what they write, and it's very hard to undercut that in the belief that that something else, some other version of this, is going to actually acquire a larger readership or make you famous or make you rich or whatever. It can be really hard because I think that whole thing about the writing process is it's a throwing up the dice, um, where you're simply gambling on the thing that you are doing actually finding an audience, but you have to just keep doing the thing that you are doing. That's the thing. So um, it's yeah. I don't know. Personally, I don't know how you. I can't imagine making that compromise. I don't know if writers have made that compromise, or I don't know if it's a case of each of us reaches our level of competence, if you will, or the things that inspire us, the things that sort of feed our ambition, and that's where we end up. And but that may be at various sort of levels of effective communication. In other words, yeah, I'll just leave it at that: effective communication. And I certainly hold myself as not as effective as a good many other writers of fantasy in terms of that communication. So
And that, I mean, there are choices you make in terms of the style in which you write, the approach that you take. And obviously for you, this is the approach that you wanted to take. This is the style you wanted to use. This is the one that you're most comfortable with and you think best serves the story, the themes that you're exploring. So that's why you have that. And other authors may feel, yeah, I want a different style because we know that from your other works, you can write in other styles. But it seems that this story was the Malazan Book of the Fallen is very much in a particular style.
yeah, yeah. Um, but the sense of an audience, I thought Forge of Darkness was actually going to be far more successful than the Malazan stuff. How wrong was I, right? So I really have no clue in terms of what a readership's going to pick up and what they're going to run with. And I guess I've kind of given up trying to anticipate those kinds of things. But at the same time, when you start a new project, you need to approach it with the belief that it's going to be the most successful thing you've written. Because without that, there's nothing to sort of push you onwards. There's nothing to sort of drag you through the story and give you that momentum.
But I suppose people, I think sometimes we fool ourselves into thinking because X was successful, if I write a variant of X in that style with a similar story, I will be as successful. And if we look at the number of sort of imitators, particularly say the Harry Potter series, none of them have ever achieved the same success as the Harry Potter series. And even the Harry Potter series is not unique in the type of story it was, the type of characters that were there, or even the setting, or all those different narrative elements. There are plenty of precursors to Harry Potter that never achieved the fame and fortune that that series achieved. I think it's a fool's gamble sometimes to try and go, yes,
Sure.
this is what the market will be.
Well, yeah, and then once once it's in the viewer in the marketplace, if you will. I mean, one could even argue that even Harry Potter never achieved the success of Harry Potter, right? Because the audience then builds this expectation, and she was still writing the series when it hit the stratosphere. And so the subsequent books had that added pressure on them of sort of matching that audience expectation, and that's pretty rough as well. So,
And from a structural point of view, it's a very curious series because the first three books are very clearly children's fantasy.
yeah,
The fourth book is a, a strange sort of amalgam of children's moving through to more teenage. And then the last three books are almost an entirely different series.
yeah,
They're much, much longer, much darker in tone, but it still have elements of that whimsical world that fitted with a children's fantasy, but doesn't necessarily fit a young adult fantasy where you expect more sort of cohesiveness around the world building and those foundational aspects. Because it had started out whimsical, those things sometimes felt out of place in the later books. So I mean, structurally, it is a very strange series for me, but absolutely fascinating because it was being built, uh, then became famous, and then there was this whole transition that we watched as it was being written,
yeah.
and that must have been very unnerving
Oh,
for
I would think
J.K.
so.
Rowling.
Yeah, yeah.
But anyway, we were going to look at chapter 19, the scene between Udinaas and Rhulad after Rhulad has kicked everyone out of the throne room and forbidden Mayan from beating Featherwitch.
Featherwitch. Yeah.
Um, and just to talk about the scene in general here, one of the reasons I like this scene is, firstly, it is showing us Rhulad in a much more sympathetic light, because we have seen him as the arrogant younger brother. We've seen him as the preening sort of adolescent. We've seen him be to be honest, a bit of an asshole. He has stolen his brother's fiance. He's become the emperor. He's been bound in all of these coins. There are monstrous things about him. There are dangerous things about him. But our our sympathy for him, our empathy for him, hasn't really been extended, I think, much before this point. This is the point, I think, where a lot of readers finally connect with him as a character deserving of understanding.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, in many respects, this is not an emperor speaking with a slave. It's a slave speaking with a slave. Only one of them realizes he's a slave. Only one of them has the social structure that actually has institutionalized his slavery. But even then, you know, at one point he has to sort of explain to Rhulad that there are hierarchies even within those slaves that are part of the Lotharii community. And so it's like there is no escape. You know, even if you think in terms of Udinaas, and I mean, his only escapes have been through dreams, and those have been pretty fraught. And he didn't have much agency in you know, in any of those as well. So it's an interesting sort of pushing these two characters together. And I think I probably realized that they have to be together because Udinaas was there when Rhulad was first, you know, delivered back into the realm of the living, and it was Udinaas' job to prepare the corpse that then, you know, became Rhulad again. So they are bound in that respect, and it's interesting. I mean, one creates a scene, and by virtue of that scene, you realize that these two characters are bound, and they're going to have to be bound within the rest of the novel in some fashion or another. And then, you know, that sort of builds the relationship for them right from the start, because there was great compassion in Udinaas' response to Rhulad coming back. But Udinaas is a pretty conflicted character as well. So it's interesting, yeah, to see them play out and avoid sort of some of the central aspects of their own personal traumas while having this conversation.
Because it's strange. Udinaas in that scene where Rhulad reawakens, sort of comes back to life after being covered in the burning coins, and Udinaas is sympathetic towards him and is doing that sort of soft crooning, the way that you would to a startled child or a startled animal. That uh, Udinaas in that scene is extending a lot of sympathy, but for me as a reader, I wasn't particularly sympathetic toward Rhulad at that point because to me it was so monstrous that it was very hard to see past the monstrosity of it to realize that there was in some respects, a victim underneath all of that.
Yeah, yeah.
And then with his behavior as, you know, claiming to be the new emperor, claiming his brother's betrothed, that element of sort of monstrosity is emphasized. And you have him covered in the wax, covered in the gold coins. His hair is dirty and lank. Even here, I think you emphasize that his fingernails have grown long and yellowed, that there is an element of the monstrous to him. But this is the scene where we go beyond that and we now are trying to connect to the person inside this particular physicality and to understand the pain and suffering of that character. So that's why I think this is the scene where a reader really can connect with Rhulad in that way, something that Udinaas was aware of far sooner than, say, perhaps I was.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
I think so.
Or is it just because I'm cynical and cruel?
No, I think so. It's. I mean, okay, Rulad's just kicked everybody else out of the throne room, um, and then he sort of talks to himself. He's not really addressing Udinaas to begin with, and he's now, you know, using the plural, the royal we is at work here, um, which I think, you know, represents his efforts to almost distance himself from the role that he has found himself in. Um, so man, she's a dead thing. So yeah, he's voicing a lot of his thought process to begin with, and the mistakes that he made, not regrets, but mistakes. So he hasn't quite reached regret yet.
Yeah,
But then he
because he has.
says, "And you slave, what secrets do you hide?" And the curious thing is, you know, this is an emperor demanding an answer from a slave, and the slave doesn't answer. So Yeah.
I think like it's interesting because Rulad lowered the sword and studied Udinaas for a time. We're not blind to all those who would seek advantage. The warlock king sees us as too young, too ignorant, but he knows nothing of the truths we have seen. Mayan, she is a dead thing beneath me. We should have left her to fear. That was a mistake. He blinked as if recovering himself, then regarded Udinaas with open suspicion. So what you were just saying there about he's not addressing Udinaas. He was looking at Udinaas and then his mind has wandered and he's talking to himself. And it's not quite the same as sort of Gollum and Smeagol from The Lord of the Rings. But it's almost like he's muttering to himself, and then you have that line. He blinked as if recovering himself, then regarded Udinaas with open suspicion. Because he's just blabbed a whole lot of
Yeah.
personal details and gone, oh dear, the slave is still here, and is immediately suspicious. So, a new
Yeah.
slave, what secrets do you hide? And you have, although Udinaas does not answer, Udinaas lowered himself to one knee, said nothing.
Yeah.
And you have both
It-
deference
yeah. It's
and
equivalent. It's equivalent of the dog rolling onto its back and exposing its neck, basically. But I mean, there is the element of Gollum and Smeagol. There's also Grendel from John Gardner's novel is in this because it's power that creates monstrosity, if you will, that then starts to physically even twist. Um, and the reason, I mean, I bring that up because later on in the section, it's Udinus who actually points out the symbolic meaning of uh, the disfigurement of Rhulad via the coins and how that relates to leather as a kingdom. So,
but
yeah.
the point I'd wanted to make about Udinaas lowered himself to one day, said nothing, was it is both deference and defiance.
Yeah.
So yes, it is the I'm submitting to your will, but I'm not answering your question. It is this curious blend of both. And if you think of his position as a slave, it's the appearance of conforming, the appearance of following commands, but maintaining an individual defiance. And it's this very fine line. And I think it is reflective of Udinaas as a smart and canny character, that he, in that moment, is kind of he has learned how to walk that line and read the people in the room to see what he can get away with.
Yeah, I mean, I also saw, I think I saw Udinus. I loved writing Udinus, but um, I saw him as a character with nothing to lose. You know, he was sort of already, you know, put in a position where the whims of others could take his life at any time. And, you know, he's already been, you know, invaded internally. Um, and then the dreams, and I think he's already, you know, Shaltatha lore has already got to him. Um, so he really has nothing to lose, and yet there is some element of him that's still capable of caring, of extending empathy to another character, to another person, and that's the thing that keeps dragging him sort of back into the decisions he keeps making, that he then immediately regrets. So
Because it's interesting because Udinaas he's possessed by the Wyval,
with all
Wivel. Okay, he's possessed by
Loki,
the yeah. So that thing's in him, um,
sorry,
and
I was about to interrupt yet again. So, anyways, go ahead.
right. So the dragon-like thing is in him. Um, that he is suffering the effects of he's sharing his body, his psyche, his spirit, everything with this alien creature. And then in addition to that, he has the shade, Wither, is hiding in his shadow and invading his mind and talking to him. Like this is not a guy who's spending a lot of time on his own.
No.
So he has a lot going on, and all of it is being hidden from the eater around him, because if they knew about the Wyval, if they knew about the shade, they would just execute Udinaas. So he is walking around with a death sentence should he be discovered. And of course, this is what Rhulad is threatening to do in this moment. He goes, I'm going to command one of these shades to search through you. And Udinaas is like, well, the game's up. So it's, nothing will be hidden from us, Rhulad said. Look up, Udinaas. He did, and saw a wraith crouched at his side. The shade shall examine you, slave. It will see if you are hiding poison within you. Udinaas nodded. Yes, do this, Rhulad. I am weary. I want an end. So we have his internal thoughts. He goes, the game is up. Rhulad is going to discover that I've been infected with the Wyval blood, that I have a shade hidden in my own shadow. The jig is up. I'm going to get caught, and he's going to kill me. And he's okay with that. He's tired. He is a slave. He goes, enough's enough. And that is such an understated moment, but very clear about Udinaas just, and he's accepting. Udinaas nodded, and he's accepting of his fate in this. He's not going to fight it. And of course, you then undercut all of this, because the shade that Rhulad is commanding to do this is in fact Wither, the shade that's been residing in Udinaas's shadow.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and it's basically, it shows that Rhulad's sort of command or his knowledge of the shades is actually incomplete, and he's also assuming that nobody else has any knowledge of these shades. And then, of course, the first thing Wither does is basically undermine all of Rhulad's authority to command him to do anything, command it. Yeah. And then the irony of, oh, such secrets. I mean, that's kind of mocking.
Because we have then that dialogue between Udinaas and the Wraith, this internal dialogue, because they're speaking mind to mind. And you have Udinaas say, clever Wither, I assume you volunteered. So, this is something that obviously Rhulad is not party to. He sees his slave in front of him, leaning down and accepting all of this. He sees the shade going in, and it's a shadow. There are no features to be read. There's no body language to be read in this. And because Rhulad's command is not 100%, he doesn't realize that the shades can lie to him, that they can manipulate him. And Wither is not sparing in his assessment. Do you imagine we would willingly accede to his demands? This bastard has used us sorely. I am unbound, and that has made me useful, for I am proof against compulsion where my kin are not. Can he tell the difference? Evidently, he cannot. Wither's not particularly nice here.
No.
But again, from his perspective, this is what we have found out in the course of this novel. These shades are not the ancestors of the Eater.
No.
These shades are the dead slaughtered by the Eater at that battle at the shattering of Emerlan.
Yeah.
And so this is actually this horrible eternal prison that their spirits have been bound to serve their murderers. You can imagine them not being happy about being ordered around.
No, they're not happy. And of course, this is one of the things that Cam and I both sort of really messed around with in the gaming, was the notion of the demonic realm and the notion of conjuring and binding demons, which, sort of is the D&D sort of standard for the necromancer anyways. And then the idea that, these things are being, plucked from their own homes, and yet accordingly are fairly resistant to sort of being compelled to do anything. And given the options, they'll try to weasel their way out of it. Or they're strong enough, they'll actually turn on the summoner and take them out. But just sort of to sort of unfold those other realms, and to give a sense that they're places of with complete cultures and lives that are lived, that they're not all standing around waiting to be plucked and summoned. They're busy with their own existence and their own lives. And of course, with the Taistandi in this case, yeah, they're seriously imprisoned and unable to do much. So yeah, they're all going to have to sort of subvert the efforts of anyone who tries to compel them.
Obviously, what's interesting is Wither as an unbound shade has a lot of freedom, whereas the bound ones are bound to follow commands. And we see a lot of that in wish narratives, where you have to be very careful about your command as to how the creature will carry it out. Now, that's not an aspect of this that you particularly explore in this story, but it is fascinating that this idea of these are not just slaves, but they are slaves whose will has been taken away as well. They are magically compelled.
Yeah, but even within that context, they do have some agency, because none of them, I'm sure, were fighting to jump to Rhulad's command, and if anything, their hands were pushing Wither forward, because this is perfect for them, because he's unbound, or it's unbound. I can't remember if it's just an it. I can't remember. But.
Well, Wither slipped back, resuming its swirling man shape in front of Udinaas. So obviously, Wither is not going to betray Udinaas's secrets. There's no point. Wither is one of those secrets, so it's not going to betray itself.
Yeah.
Rhulad released one hand from the sword to claw at his face. He spun round, took 2 steps, then howled his rage. Why are they lying to us? We cannot trust them, not any of them. He turned. Stand, Udinaas. You alone do not lie. You alone can be trusted. He strode to the throne and sat. We need to think. We need to make sense of this. Hanan Mosag, he covets our power, doesn't he? Now, what I find absolutely fascinating here is Rhulad does not wait for Wither to make any sort of pronouncement. We don't get Wither's exchange with Rhulad. We don't get what Wither tells Rhulad. But it's implied that Wither has slipped back. It's communicated something to Rhulad, and Rhulad has been enraged and incensed by it. And putting sort of 2 and 2 together in this, he has been told by Mayan and Hanan Mosag and others that Udinaas cannot be trusted because he has the Wivel blood. And the shade has now said, no, he doesn't. And so, even though he does. Yeah. So Rhulad is now going, my wife is lying to me. The Warlock King, who is meant to be my servant and advisor, he's lying to me. The only person I can trust is Udinaas.
Yeah. Yeah, which serves Wither's purpose, I would say, quite directly. And it's one of those cases where I don't want to be explicit in sort of, because we're tied to Udinaas' point of view. I mean, how is he going to actually be able to hear the exchange between Wither and Rhulad? I mean, he can't. So once you're sort of stuck with that, then there has to be enough in place there that Udinaas can witness that allows him to, put together something of what's been said. And of course, in that case, it has to be an emotional response from Rhulad that basically undermines all these other characters, which then, of course, places Udinaas front and center as the one to be trusted. Yeah. So it's not a case of writing. If I had taken out all the earlier stuff and just said you alone can be trusted, or Wither tells me you can be trusted, and presumably you trust Wither, it doesn't have the same impact as that heavy emotional stuff where it's all, I mean, the first question is, why are they lying to us, right? It's all about Rhulad. That's his emotional response. And so there's a progression there. It's first the question, why are they lying to us? And then the answer, or not even the answer, but the only response available to Rhulad is, we cannot trust them. And so there's a progression in that sense, in terms of a thought process anyways.
And that's the thing that gives me the clue to remember that the previous scene had been about them accusing Udinaas of having these things, and that's why he was doing this. And instead of looking at it solely at what is happening in the scene of this investigation of Udinaas, to remember there are repercussions for decisions and actions outside of that moment. That to think of Rhulad as a character with relationships that go beyond the specific moment on the page, and that just because he's in this moment doesn't mean that this moment is the most important to him, because obviously if Udinaas is not infected as he's been told by Wither, the most important thing is his wife is lying to him, his advisor is lying to him because they told him he was. And you know, that as a simple reminder sometimes that characters don't always react to the thing right then and there. They should be reacting to the thing most important to them, and that's sometimes very easy to overlook because we get carried away with what is on the page, or like in a film, what is happening right then and there, that we expect that to be the reaction, not the reaction about something that happened 5 minutes ago.
Yeah, and you know, that section we talked about with Saren Pedak, you know, all the things that happened to her are what led to her walking into the sea, right? And they're, you know, well behind her at that point. This is, I think, this paragraph has as the first sort of invitation, if you will, to empathy for Rhulad, because you can see how naive he is when he says, you know, Han and Mosag, he covets our power, doesn't he? Well, no freaking kidding, right? You know, right? It's right there.
It's, what Han and Mosag, the warlock king who'd united the tribes, and then you come along and declare yourself emperor with the sword that he had sent you to get. You,
yeah,
Sherlock Rhulad the First.
Exactly. Yeah.
And of course,
like, you know, in that sense, it's, you're almost, well, I guess the effort is to give him a childlike element to it. He's always been the youngest anyways, so he's in that position. But there is a childlike aspect to Rhulad that's related to the power he has been given now, but also his social standing and the fact that everything has been overturned, and it's all sort of shattered around him.
And yeah, like while yes, he is emperor, he has this power, he doesn't know how to use it. He doesn't have the maturity to know how to use it. He hasn't been educated in these political games, or to have that life experience to know how to balance things and weigh things. He doesn't have any of that. And you know, we sometimes forget, even at this stage, regardless of his actual number of years alive, he is essentially a teenager who has become immortal, died, been brought back to life, tortured because he's now burnt with all of these gold coins, has essentially taken over an entire kingdom of all of these things, and everyone is scared of him. You know, that must be like a very confusing, disorienting, very hard to know who to trust, what to trust, and what to do. And he can't find guidance from anyone because he must command his brothers. And can he trust Fear? Well, he stole Fear's fiance. Is Fear going to do the right thing, or is Fear resentful? He doesn't know, and he's treated Fear badly. Trull has always looked down on him and made fun of him, so he can't really trust Trull. Binadas, oh well, he was training to be a warlock under the Warlock King. Well, I can't trust him because he might be siding with Han and Mosag. Who can I trust? The family slave Udinaas, the one who has been with the family my entire life, or well, his entire life.
Hmm.
I've known for years, who was there when I awoke. We can see how you've built up and engineered a scene in which, yes, Udinaas is the natural person now for Rhulad to bond with.
Yeah, and I mean, you cannot win every argument with a sword, right? And so I was thinking back that there was a comic book I think I read. It was either Conan or it was King Kull, but one of the Howard um, barbarian heroes, or well, or sword wielding heroes. Anyways, and I think the episode was called, or maybe it finished. The comic finished with a huge battle as um, people are trying to sort of take Conan down from the throne that he's acquired, and he has a whole battle axe, and he ends up killing everybody who's coming at him. And I think the final drawn image was him crouched in front of a blood splashed throne, and he's holding this battle axe, double bladed axe with blood dripping from it and gore everywhere. And his final line is something like, "By this axe I rule." And I remember even when I was 15 years old reading this, thinking, yeah, well, that's not going to work. And so in many respects, Rulad's kind of in that position. He's got this sword that basically allows him to survive every mistake he makes, and in that respect, he sort of answers the dream of the ultimate dream of every tyrant that ever existed. Whereas, regardless of the mistakes I make, I stay in power. Um, and yet, of course, that sword's not enough. And then the question is, in order to rule, you'll need advisors, and you'll have to trust them. And of all the ones he finds he can trust, it's Udinaas. But of course, we've been in his point of view for the entire novel, the slave's point of view, and we know I don't know about trusting this guy. It's
But
probably not a good idea.
it's interesting you bring up that thing about ruling by the sword and that overly simplistic
Yeah.
notion. Because there's another trope that happens in a lot of stories where the bad guy is standing, the villain is standing there, and it's the henchman comes in. I failed to kill him, my liege, and the bad guy, to demonstrate how bad he is, how villainous he is, he executes the henchman in front of all the others. No, they will now fear me more.
Yeah.
And every time I see that, I think, if that was me sitting in that room as one of these henchmen, as soon as his back's turned, I'm like, no, lads, and get him, because one mistake and you die. That's
Yeah.
what you would run out of henchmen so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
How can you manage an evil empire if you're constantly killing your own subordinates all the time? But it always struck me as such a cliched and, dare I say it, lazy way to establish villainy.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. There's a classic Get Smart episode where I think Max ends up in this castle on some island, and the villain has a henchman called Igor. I think he's Igor, something along those lines. Um, and there's this pit of molten lava in between Maxwell Smart, the secret agent, and the villain. And the villain's got a gun in his hand, and they're having a conversation. The henchman's just off to one side, and they're close enough so that Max can surprise him and sort of karate chop the villain's hand, and the gun falls into the magma. And the villain says, "I'll get it," and he just walks straight down into the magma and dies, obviously. And the villain looks at Max and he says, "Good henchmen are really hard to find these days." I loved it. I remember cracking up when I saw it. But anyways, yeah, you're right. It is a lazy,
well,
and
maybe not
pointless.
lazy, maybe cheap. Maybe cheap
It's
is a slightly
pointless
better
too.
way.
Yeah, but it's counterproductive, right? Because you're not buying loyalty from your henchmen by by killing them for making a mistake. You know, that just doesn't make any sense. So
But I think that's why when we see evil Dark Lord TM with Dark Horde TM and evil henchman TM
yeah.
pending, um, that's why we see a lot of those as cliches, as things that we almost roll our eyes at now, because we have seen it so often. We've seen it done very poorly. And when we see complexity, like we see here with Rhulad, like Rhulad is not a good person. Udinaas is not a good person, but they are complex and they are not all evil. Hanan Mosag is not all evil. Like, he's still not good. I wouldn't want to be hanging out with him after work and going for a quick bite to eat. But he's not a mustachio twirling villain. And he's not, oh, you failed me, I'm now going to kill all of you because you failed. That's a waste of resources. His plan at the beginning was to just, pay the Sengar family enough to cut off Rhulad's hands so he could have the sword. After an appropriate period of mourning, then cut off the hands.
Yeah.
I like pragmatism in bad guys. But
well, I never saw him as a bad guy at all. But all his plans went awry, and at that point, you have to sort of plan on the fly, as it were, and take advantage of whatever situation you can. I mean, he had a fair idea of what he was going to do once he got that sword. Would he have been better with the sword than Rhulad? Maybe in some respects, no, much worse.
Well, certainly, I think he would have been far more frightening because he wanted that. He had already positioned himself as the Warlock King. He already commanded this magical power. Then he was going to get immortality. He was already orchestrating the gathering of the clans to invade the Lethari. Like, this was what happens. All of what Rhulad orchestrates and says, oh no, we're going to go to war. This is all Hanan Mosag's plan anyway. This was Hanan Mosag's plan from the very beginning. It just so happens he's not the one in charge of things. But I think one of the reasons I think of Hanan Mosag as evil is I see what he does to the Kristnan, the apprentice warlocks, how they are used up by this horrendous, horrific magic that they channel. That the devastation that they wreak on the humans, on the Lethari.
Yeah.
This, I think it must be very similar to like a field of battle where one side is used to bows and arrows and then the other side napalms them. And that change, that scale, that alteration of the rules of engagement into something so horrific and indiscriminate is just shocking and monstrous. And if you were witnessing that for the very first time, it's hard not to see those that unleash such devastation with anything but villainy.
I would imagine people of Nagasaki thought that in 1945. Yeah.
And yet we know that with all of these things, there's at least two sides to every story. There are reasons why these things have happened. And it is not because people are sitting there going, this will be a lot of fun, I'm just going to go and incinerate. People are forced into positions to perform acts that in the cool, calm light of day at a different time when you can just look at all the facts logically, you go, I don't agree with your decision. You go, you weren't there.
Absolutely. And Hanan Mosag, you're right. I mean, he would have been far more formidable by far. But then you wouldn't have had the close relationship that I needed between Trull and Rhulad. Trull and the leader. Trull then would have simply been one more warrior in service to Hanan Mosag, which would have changed everything. So it really had to be one of the brothers in order for Trull's story to make more sense.
Because I think the only way that you could have achieved the same sort of thing is to go back in time to House of Chains, change that prologue to Binidas and not Trull, and then you could have had
Yeah.
Hanan Mosag, because Binidas, as one of his apprentices, as one of his disciples, would have given you that closeness, and you could have had a similar uh, power
Yeah,
dynamic.
yeah, probably. Yeah.
But time travel hasn't been invented yet, so you were stuck on that one.
Well, I mean, it's been completely invented in the novels. It's all over the place. You can do whatever you want, right?
Um,
Yeah.
but it's just because you'd set this up as Troll's story.
Yes, exactly.
It would have involved a lot of fancy footwork to
Yeah.
suddenly have it. Well, it's actually Binidas was all of this, but then Troll stepped in at the end to take his punishment. You could have come up with a narrative reason for it, but it would have felt a little bit more artificial, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
sorry.
Anyways, yeah. So I mean, Udinaas basically lays out what's obvious to everyone, the readers included, in describing Hannah Mosag's motivations.
You stole his throne, Emperor, and the sword he believed was rightly his. He wants it still, does he? A sudden laugh, chilling and brutal. Oh, he's welcome to it. No, we cannot. Mustn't. Impossible. And what of our wife? And this is a difficult passage because Mayan is broken. She wanted nothing real from her flirting with you. You were the youngest brother to the man she would marry. She sought allies within the Sengar household. He stopped there, seeing the spasms return to Rhulad, the extremity of his emotions too close to an edge, a precipice, and it would not do to send him over it. Not yet. Perhaps not at all. And this, again, this is where, I was saying that this is when, as a reader, I was coming to sympathize with Rhulad to some extent, or at least empathize, because although he has done these terrible things, we see Udinaas here giving him the brutal truth, telling him as it is, because this is stripped away of all veneer of nicety. He's not hiding anything or reframing things in a polite way to spare Rhulad's feelings. Mayan is broken. She never loved you. She didn't really like you. She just wanted an ally in the household that she was marrying into. And that rejection for an adolescent boy.
Yeah, there's an element of cruelty here in Udinaas. But at the same time, it's self-recrimination for Udinaas, because what he's describing regarding Mayan and the Sengar family, or Rhulad's naive sort of desire for Mayan and all that stuff, is paralleled by Udinaas and Featherwitch. So there's that other side that's sort of lurking behind the scene there in terms of those blunt statements coming from Udinaas.
But it's interesting because Udinaas has, in previous things, he's admitted that yes, he is infatuated with Featherwitch. It's infatuation or love. He's not really sure, but he knows that she doesn't feel that for him. He's aware enough of that. Whereas we get a sense here that this is a shock to Rhulad.
Yeah.
That Rhulad hasn't had that awareness or introspection. And, remembering back to when I was a teenager, when you're challenged with your own stupidity, when you're shown how stupid you've been, when you've fooled yourself into believing something, what is your response to that? Do you go, yeah, you know what? You're right. I will learn from this. This is a learning experience. I'll take this on board. I'm going to be a better person. Maybe other people, when they were teenagers, had that maturity and presence of mind. I think I possibly would have reacted badly and angrily and denied that that was the truth, or blamed the person telling me, which is kind of what we see here, that we see Rhulad reacting with extreme emotion and barely holding on to any sort of sane behavior.
Yeah. But I mean, then Udinaas basically undermines his own thinking within that paragraph in the italicized stuff. Questioning, recognizing that what he just said had an element of vengeance or spite. So,
Yeah. These are not my thoughts, not my inclinations. Remember that, Udinaas, before you do worse than would Hanan Mosag.
yeah.
And then we get, he says, "Sire," he said softly, "Mayan is lost and hurting, and you're the only one who can help her." And again, we see this balancing. Rhulad has been monstrous. He hasn't been forgiven for these monstrous acts, but he is still hurting. He is still in pain. He is still lost. Do we deny sympathy and empathy and compassion just because people are not deserving of it in our estimation because they did something bad? Or are the most broken the most likely to have done bad things, and therefore the most likely to need compassion and understanding to be cured, to be helped, to be brought back into themselves in a more complete sense and to help heal?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not something you answer.
No, and no, I mean, Udinaas offers to this broken individual almost kind of a branch of salvation, if you will, that he can grasp onto, where he then, somebody's even worse off than you are, Rhulad. So, help her. And so, I mean, yeah, psychologically, it kind of, Udinaas is being very cagey here, be very careful, and offering these things up. But the emperor doesn't trust it, right? His response. So.
And that was, you speak to save the slave woman. But and again, you had mentioned earlier that there was this connection to Featherwitch in Udinaas's mind. This is that sort of thematic connection you had already made, the subtextual connection, and it's, "Featherwitch knows only hatred for me, sire. I am indebted while she is not. My desire for her was hubris, and she would punish me for it." So there is that awareness in Udinaas, but and this is the thing, Udinaas to me is such a complicated character because you don't spell it out here. Is he saying this because he's trying to manipulate Rhulad into doing something so that maybe he can get Featherwitch, or is this an honest admission about his own hubris?
Yeah, and I would argue that it's both. That it's an honest admission, but the element of hope lingers and always will, because that's just the stuff that sort of sticks to those kind of infatuations or love or whatever.
Well, and that's the nature of caring for someone. Just because they don't care for you doesn't mean you go, "Oh, I'll just turn that off like a switch then."
Yeah, exactly.
So we have this where Udinaas is potentially admitting his own hubris, admitting his own flaw. We have that, not contradiction, but complexity of, but still having the hope. And, I think this raises an interesting point about narrative in general. Narrative is an artificial construct. Reality, well, there are some arguments that reality is an artificial construct as well, but let's not get into that philosophical debate. But when we have characters that act in contradictory ways, that is bad in narrative because we go, that character is not consistent. But point out anyone in real life who is truly consistent. So, I mean, I think this is an interesting point to get like an author, a writer's perspective on.
Yeah, I think there can be a danger when you're creating a character it's not a, well, I don't know if it's a danger, but one is at risk, put it that way, in creating a character that possesses internal contradictions. Because quite often somebody may read that and say, well, that's not a consistent character, that's bad characterization. But it's actually an effort to point out that a singular character's motivations, or singular motivation to a character, is unrealistic. And if it actually did exist, and maybe has to some extent historically among real people, it's a pretty frightening prospect of someone who is driven to that extent. So yeah, I always prefer to really muddy the internal waters for characters. So, you mentioned the hubris. That's Featherwitch's attitude regarding Udina's emotional attachment to her. So it's not quite him saying it was my hubris. It's her point of view that any expression of desire from Udinaas is hubris, because she is not indebted and he is. So, but yeah, he lays it out, and it's kind of all over the place, but it's also very sort of honest and blunt, because that's the track he's now on. So he's establishing the parameters of the relationship between himself and Rhulad, as being the straight talker, and yet applying the same thing to his interpretations of his own actions and his own feelings as well. So he's offering up that honesty as a kind of invitation to reciprocity from Rhulad. So,
because it's just to go back to the comment about consistency in character. If a character is incredibly consistent and is always focused on that sort of narrative ideal of always making sure they do that thing, while you say if you put in the inherent contradictions and complexity of character, you run the risk of them appearing inconsistent. You can err too far in the other direction and they become two-dimensional, where it is they are a cardboard cutout that they exist solely for that narrative purpose. So again, I think there's a sliding scale here where if we think of the ultimate end of it being narrative artificiality and serving plot, story, or narrative function, and that's where you get your two-dimensional character. To the very far side on the other direction, which is the inherent complexity and contradictions of the modern psyche, of all of our little peccadillos and idiosyncrasies, and the cognitive dissonance that we entertain on a daily basis, but is extraordinarily complex, and we have to pay trained professionals thousands of dollars an hour to analyze our brains. That's probably too much for a lot of characters in narrative, and it would be too complex. That there always has to be movement between those, and a singular character at different points can be at different points on that scale. It's not that it always has to be exactly at one point, or there is a happy medium balancing point. The narrative is going to change. The narrative is going to dictate certain things. Character motivations and arcs will also change and affect that balance. So it's just on that point, I think thinking about it in terms of, is it a consistent character, as if consistency is the only thing that's important, is potentially where you run into these very flat characters. And we want flawed characters, we want rounded characters. But again, if you go too far in that direction, you're adding layers and layers and layers of complexity that either require a lot of exposition and exploration on the page, or will end up looking inconsistent. So I think that's a curious balancing act that authors have to try and perform.
And one of the ways to do it structurally, as the writer, is to create some separation between the character's spoken dialogue and the character's internal mindset. In other words, you can pull those two things very far apart. They're linked to each other, but quite often you can create a dialogue from a character that's basically leapfrogging across a stream, but taking every second stone is the bit of dialogue that we get, and the other stuff's it's unwritten, but it's there, and it's the thing that's linking everything together. And so, yeah, in that respect, if you want to create that sense of complexity, juxtapose the internal monologue with the dialogue in terms of its content, so that one's not repeating the other. One can be actually in argument with the other. But the stuff that's spoken, of course, it's spoken with the assumption that it's communicating with somebody else, and there is a relationship between the two speakers that is going to dictate what is said and how it is said. So that's at play with dialogue, but the internal monologue can run in completely different direction, and that can really offer up a lot of maneuvering room for the writer in terms of creating that complexity.
And what is interesting is, obviously, okay, so let's say you wrote the dialogue and then you had the internal monologue that's in argument. And so you end up with this whole passage with the dialogue and the internal monologue all worked through. And then you went back through and just deleted out the internal monologue.
Yeah.
What are you left with? You're left with a very natural sounding exchange. Because I was just looking at the section that we're on, where we have Rhulad. You speak to save the slave woman, the emperor said in a rough whisper. Feather witch knows only hatred for me, sire. I am indebted while she is not. My desire for her was hubris, and she would punish me for it. Your desire for her. Would I save her from beatings? Of course I would, sire, just as you would do the same, as indeed you just did not a moment ago. Udinaas does not answer the question or the response that has been put to him. He skips on. You speak to save the slave woman. She knows only hatred for me. That's not what was being said, but people can look at that. And I think if you took this out of context, you could look at that and go, this is very disjointed dialogue. This dialogue doesn't make sense. The characters aren't responding to each other. And weirdly enough, I look at this and go, this is incredibly naturalistic dialogue. Because if
I would say they were absolutely responding to each other. What they're not doing is Q&A, right? So even when Rhulad says your desire for her, it's not a question mark at the end of that, which is a completely different way of it's a completely different statement. If I were to throw a question mark at the end, I would simplify it in a sense. But he's simply repeating the words, or not. My desire for her, your desire for her. Yeah, I mean, he's simply reiterating, because that's the thing he got hung up on in the response that Udinaas made. So they are interacting and they're responding to what each other is saying, just not in a direct fashion, but an indirect fashion. And the gaps in between should be pretty clear, in the sense that we're having a conversation here. Because if you listen to conversations, and I do it all the time when I sit in cafes, because they're extraordinary. And they're like this. There's so much that is stepped over because it's mutually understood, and it goes fast. It's not a question of people having to pause and think about it. No, it's understood very, very quickly, that unspoken stuff. And so, good exercise for writers is to listen in on conversations.
Spycraft. But
Spycraft, yeah.
But I was,
and one great way of doing it is to put the earbuds in or the headphones on, but not listen to anything, because then they think you're listening to music when you're actually listening to them. I know
Oh
it's
well,
evil. It's evil.
now you've just given away one of the writer's secrets.
It is one of the writer's secrets.
um, but the reason I would say that to me this always feels like naturalistic dialogue, because when I think of conversations that I have with people I know, that we don't speak always in full sentence statements and then pose a question at the end and go, and your response? And then they go, well, and they basically go through the whole thing. And that is my response to your thing. And I now respond, what is your response? It doesn't, it's not never that formal that we have sentence fragments. We start talking and making a point and then stop because we know that they understand where the point is going and we don't need to carry on any further. And then they kind of acknowledge that point and go, but what you're actually getting at. So they skip a whole chunk of the conversation because we both know that we both agree about that chunk and they've moved on to the more interesting bit, at least to them. So,
Yeah.
that's what I see in this, that this is a dialogue that to me that flows because it seems like a natural, normal, actual, real conversation rather than the artificial exchange of dialogue that we can sometimes get in narrative. That was the point that I was going to be making about this.
And definitely when you're thinking in terms as a writer in terms of dialogue, you have to step back and remind yourself that there is more than one person involved in this dialogue. And even though you're stuck with one point of view, generally, it can be an exercise to go into both points of view, and that can be a lot of fun. But I mean, that's a writing exercise. But generally, you're stuck with one of the points of view. But there are, in this case, two people talking, and the subject may be subject A, but one of them is more interested in, I don't know. No, let's do it this way. Subject 1, and one of them is interested in subject 1A, and the other one's interested in subject 1C. And so they're in a conversation, and each one is going to try to pull the other one to their chosen interest in that particular subject. And that's a kind of a tug of war. But it can happen where the back and forth, that tug of war is actually not laid out in written word on the page, but it's actually what's going on all the way through the entire conversation. You just don't show it. So each one is pulling it back and forth in terms of the subjects and the aspects or the positions that they're holding. And the other one listens and then pulls it back in the other opposite direction. And that's that's one aspect of dialogue where you really need to really get a sense and ask yourself as a writer, okay, well, what is this person wanting to get out of this conversation? And what is that person wanting to get out of this conversation? What does that person want to know? And what does that person want the other person not to know? All of these things are at play in a dialogue. So.
But this is a very interesting exchange because it now sets up, I think, one of the core aspects of a much more general abstract point that is something that we generally forget because we have Rhulad say, because it is sorted, what am I to make of you, Udinaas, a slave, and indebted, as if that could make you less in the eyes of another slave. And this, for me, is an absolutely fascinating point. From Rhulad's perspective, he is looking at Udinaas, and Udinaas is a slave. Featherwitch is a slave. Therefore, they are the same, because it's an external perspective on a particular group. Then within that group, there's a different hierarchy, because there are indebted slaves and other slaves. And then even within the indebted slaves, it might be, well, I am the indebted slave for that family, and that family has more power than that family. That from an external perspective, groups can appear homogenous. But when you're in that group, we suddenly see that no group is truly homogenous, that there will be further subdivisions and subdivisions and subdivisions all the way down. And we see this in the real world with when people make pronouncements about the Irish or the Canadians or the Americans. And it's always from this external perspective about. And then when you go, well, okay, let's talk about the Canadians. Well, as soon as you start narrowing it in and zooming in on that, you go, well, it suddenly starts breaking it apart and it becomes more complicated. And you then zoom in on another part. This sort of fractal and fracturing occurs again and again and again. And seeing Rhulad's confusion on this, I think this is something that we have all the time when we look at other social groups or racial groups or whatever grouping from an external perspective, that we cannot understand that we have an external perspective and we are projecting something onto that.
Yeah, and the whole novel is about the clash of these two cultures, and one being very rigid in its hierarchy in one fashion, and the other one being equally rigid but in a completely different fashion. And so this is an indication that these are Letheri slaves, and they brought Lether with them into slavery, and that's what Rhulad's struggling to sort of understand, is that those ideas have not been abandoned just because you're no longer in that civilization, in that culture.
Because you have the Letheri relinquish nothing, even when they are made into slaves. Sire, that is the truth the Teist Eater have never understood. Poor or rich, free or enslaved, we build the same houses in which to live, in which to play out the old dramas. In the end, it does not matter whether destiny embraces us or devours us. Either is as it should be, and only the errant decides our fate. So, this you can take the boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the boy. But what I like here, we build the same houses in which to live. And, obviously, you could apply that literally, that you build the same style of architectural dwelling. Fine, there's a literal meaning to that. But also, we build the same structures. We create the same societies. We organize ourselves in the ways with which we are familiar, no matter where we go. So there's that more metaphorical, symbolic message that you're playing out there.
Yeah. The other curious thing I've just noticed is that there's almost no exposition. It's just an exchange. And so, in terms of on the page, we've pulled right back from physically and visually watching these two characters. Just a few sort of little details to break things up, all from Udinaas' point of view, specifically as to how Rhulad is physically expressing his emotions without being aware of it. So it tells you that Udinaas is watching the Emperor very, very carefully, because he knows he's on thin ice here. So.
Yeah, and that's it. You have the tremors had slowed. So because of this, we get a sense that, exactly as you said, Udinaas is watching and going, he's calmed down. Okay. Getting slightly safer now, that he's not as angry. We've moved on to safer discussion territory. We've moved away from Mayan, which was making him very angry and emotional, through Featherwitch. Now we're discussing, the concept of slavery and my status as a slave, and he's much more comfortable with this. Yeah, let's move in that direction. So there's been that transition, and you can see it moving from Mayan to Featherwitch as a slave talking about this, that it is this very clear, normalized progression of subject matter. It makes perfect sense when you look at that.
Yeah, and the longer Udinaas talks, the more time Rhulad has to calm down. Yeah, so, and then Rhulad actually responds to Udinaas describing the Letheri culture by applying it back to his interactions with the Letheri up to this point, which was Helvetic. Yeah.
Um, but it's odd because Rhulad actually says something here, which is very, very important. And I think we skip over because this is not one of those big battle scenes. This is not one of those big poignant scenes. And in fact, it's Rhulad and Udinaas. These aren't the main characters really that we're trying to be invested in. But
No.
Rhulad actually says, "We may conquer them," referring to the Letheri. "We may conquer them. We may command their flesh in the manner we command yours and that of your fellow slaves. But the belief that guides them, that guides all of you, that cannot be defeated."
And that is basically the argument of the entire novel, and certainly of Reaper's Gale. Yeah, laid out. Yeah.
And it's right there, it's on the
Yeah.
page, but again, you're not putting big signposts around it, big red flashing arrows pointing down at it.
Yeah.
And I've heard fans complain about, like, how do I know what's important and what's not important? And you go, well, you find out.
Yeah.
And that's why, like, rereading and spotting lines like this, you go, how did I miss that? And it's good. You cannot anticipate which lines are always going to be absolutely key, just like in real life.
Yeah.
Conquer Lether, and it will devour you, sire, your spirit, your innocence. A savage or a strange smile twisted Rhulad's face. Innocence, this from a short-lived creature such as you. We should take offense. We should see your head torn from your shoulders. You proclaim we cannot win this war, and what are we to think of that? That is fascinating to me because there was this brief this talk about belief, the digression to talk about the errant, this god that the Letheri are embroiled with or worship. And it's, does he exist physically? I don't know. It doesn't matter. The actual embodiment of the god is not important. But when Udinaas says, "Conquer Lether, and it will devour you, sire, your spirit, your innocence," the absolute hubris and arrogance of a slave speaking to an emperor. And we see how comfortable Udinaas has become, that he knows he can kind of get away with this. And we see Rhulad does not react the way that he did earlier. This is not anger.
No.
This is not that the tremors running through him. It's a strange smile twisted Rhulad's face.
Well, because he is innocence twisted, isn't he? I mean, that's what the crippled god has done. That's what the sword has done. So there's self-mockery involved in that. And it is one of the lessons, if you're going to have a character who's on the emotional edge, make sure that each time they respond viscerally to something is not a repetition of the last time they responded viscerally to something, if you know what I mean. So you got to vary it up, and bear in mind that this is an ongoing conversation. And so the emotional peaks and troughs are going to level out as you proceed through the conversation, but occasionally you're gonna trigger something, and that's gonna, create another peak. So, because everything he's saying there, he's saying we should do all this. I should take offense, and there is no reason for Udinaas to fear this statement anymore, right? Because it's clearly I should do this, but I'm not going to. That's the implicit add-on to all of those lines.
And it's what I like is their relationship in this conversation has fundamentally shifted and changed.
Yeah.
The seeds that have been planted at various points, but this is where we see that consolidation. This is where it is cemented and put in place. And it's this moment with the strange smile. He's calmed down. You go, yep, this is who I'm going to talk to now. up until this point, it's been negotiation of it, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, but this is where Rhulad has made his determination.
Yeah. And consider the difference of if Udinaas had replied, the answer lies upon your very flesh, full stop, to the answer lies upon your very flesh, comma, sire. Because that reestablishes the relationship in the formal fashion, which is, I think, what Rhulad needed right now, right? Because he's just been challenged as emperor, and his whole purpose of conquering Lether has just been challenged. And Udinaas is not saying, this posturing as an emperor and conqueror is just ridiculous, and I'm not gonna respect it, because that would be, the step too far. That would have broken the entire thing. So one word can make all the difference in an exchange.
And I think that's a good point, is that Udinaas every once in a while does go back to referring to sire, that this element of demonstrating respect. And because of that, for someone like Rhulad, that's important.
Mm-hmm.
No one else is showing him any respect. They may
No.
fear him, but they don't respect him. And here's Udinaas, who seemingly is telling truth to power, telling it how it is, but is still respectful doing it. Now, obviously, we have all of these underlying things going on. There's a lot more complexity to it, but from his perspective, this feeds into I think Rhulad's uh, imposter syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. And then we get the Rhulad glance down. His fingernails have grown long, curved, and yellow. This is one of those technical things where there's no reason for me to give that detail without the line that followed. In other words, it's kind of backing up. Who knows? The first draft may have been Rhulad glanced down. He tapped a coin to on his chest. And I thought, oh, wait a minute, tapped. That has to be the fingernail. I better go back and give us the details on that fingernail before he taps the coin. So,
but also, you've humanized Rhulad so much in this exchange with Udinaas, and then his fingernails had grown long, curved, and yellow, and you dehumanize him with that.
well, yes, but why wouldn't you? Because, Udinaas says the answer lies upon your very flesh, sire. So suddenly we're back to the appearance sake of things. We're back to the physicality of things. We've left behind things like spirit and innocence and all of these ephemeral emotions. And it's the equivalent of Udinaas, pointing to Rhulad and saying, "Well, just look in the freaking mirror." And so that's the time for the physical detail of the fingernails, the growing monstrosity that is Rhulad, to be underscored again. But I think if the opening of this scene had been Rhulad, some comment on his long fingernails and curved and yellow, it's the wrong time and the wrong place for it. So in other words, when you're going to use physical details, and this is just me, I mean, this is how I write, but there needs to be a reason for that physical detail appearing when it appears. Otherwise, it is info dumping.
Okay.
It's just
But
a thought.
it's just the long curved and yellow is very much that sort of bestial talon claw kind of image, which dehumanizes, makes more monstrous, and it is a reminder of that monstrosity when so much of this has been building up to build that sense of intimacy. And so this is kind of taking it that step back and reevaluating him yet again.
Yeah, and it's adding some sensory elements to it as well, because you could have said he touched a coin on his chest, and that then you wouldn't need the fingernails at all, right? But that has a different effect than looking at these long curved, hard fingernails and tapping as opposed to touching a coin on the chest. So we add that little bit of sound That's an inhuman sound. It's not a human sound. Whereas with his fingertips, the tapping of, even if you use tapping, it's a blunt, soft sound and barely heard. And that's wrong for what's being talked about here.
So just moving on down a bit further here. We will speak more, Udinaas, and none other shall know of this. After all, what would they think? An emperor and a slave together working to fashion a new empire. For we must keep you a slave, mustn't we? A slave in the eyes of all others. We suspect that, were we to free you, you would leave us.
This is the final test. It's Rhulad's final test.
A sudden tremble at these words. And what is Udinaas's internal monologue response? Before we get what he says, what is it that he immediately thinks? Errant, take me. This man needs a friend.
So he knows, he senses the test. That this is Rhulad desperately reaching out and asking, are you there to take my hand, or will you flee at the first opportunity? So it's compassion. Absolutely.
And then we see what Udinaas's response is. Sire, so the immediate deferential respect, reassure your subject. Sire, I would not leave. Immediately answering the question, which, as we've established, is not something that has naturally happened all the way down here. It's always been talking about the subject, but not directly in answer to questions. So,
right,
Sire,
and think of the difference between somebody who, in an exchange with somebody else, makes 25 promises in a row, and the impact of those promises that upon the hearer, as opposed to one promise. Right, the difference is huge. It's huge. So again, it's a case of knowing when to be direct and forthright.
So, Sire, I would not leave. So that immediate reassurance that it was I who placed the coins in your flesh. There is no absolving that, no true way I could make amends, but I will stand by you through all of this. And what I find interesting here is Udinaas saying, it was I who placed the coins in the flesh. There is no absolving that, no true way I can make amends. As if Udinaas had had any choice in the matter.
Yeah.
He was a tool, an instrument of the Sengar household, because none of them wanted to do it, could be bothered to do it, so send the slave to do it.
Yeah.
And we know from that scene, if he had messed up, they would have executed him.
Yep.
So,
he's fashioning, he's concocting a reason for his loyalty that he hopes will pass muster for Rhulad. But Rhulad's in such a fragile state at this moment. He will grasp it. He will take hold of it. Yeah.
And that's it's offering someone a rationale that they can believe in. And I liked that, again, showing that Udinaas is not stupid. You know,
No.
he thought on his feet. He knows exactly what's going on. Then Rhulad's terrible eyes, so crimson bruised and hurt, shifted away from Udinaas. Do you understand, Udinaas? He asked in a whisper. I am so ... And of course, Udinaas fills in, frightened. As internal monologue, don't speak it out loud.
No, of course not. The eyes have shied away. He's not prepared to actually look this in the eye, Rhulad. Yeah.
So, and then we move on. We now, at this point, return to, now that this trust has been established, now that this relationship has been established, what started this whole thing off, the discussion of Mayan, and that is what it is returning to now. The Emperor placed a hand over his eyes. She is drowning herself in white nectar. Yes, sire. I would free her, but I cannot. Do you know why, Udinaas? She carries your child. And, you know, we have this Slaves talk,
Yeah.
servants talk, employees talk. Nothing. The only way to keep a secret: tell no one,
Mm.
and then kill yourself. Uh, but probably why that pirate treasure was never found.
Yeah, tell that to the people on Oak Island. Yeah.
um, but we started this whole thing with the argument about Mayan, and that is what it has returned to. It's come
Yeah.
full circle, and we now have Udinaas brought into Rhulad's personal sort of trust. So I think that's a really interesting sort of.
Yeah, I've often described the elliptical approach I take to writing scenes. When you ring that bell at the beginning, you want to come back to it and subtly alter it. Well, it should be subtly altered by the time you get back to it. And it does, because a pairing has actually occurred here between Rhulad and Udinaas with respect to helping Mayan, but neither is actually in a place in which they can. So because Udinaas is the one now, actually the only one, able to suggest other potential allies for Rhulad, that's what he does. And he doesn't look for another man, he looks for a woman to be the intercessor for Mayan. And it's Rhulad's mother. So,
And we all know that people love their mothers-in-law.
yeah.
Coming in to interfere, but it's just such an interesting exchange, because we see the power dynamics between an emperor and a slave move backwards and forwards in the scene.
Mm.
And it's not just about their position, but the emotional damage that one can wreak on the other, and the fact that no emotional damage can be done back, but physical damage could be done back. The play of the different types of power moving here in this, and the vulnerabilities.
And this is why, you know, in terms of writing, if you're going to have just two characters in a dialogue, if one is holding all the power, that dialogue gets boring very quickly. There has to be some avenue, some aspect that can allow that power shift to flip back and forth, and to be waged over in terms of verbal battles. And that makes dialogue very interesting and a lot of fun to write. But if it's just one person with their, you know, their foot on the throat of the other person, it's not very interesting.
Well, you know, it's villain monologuing at that stage.
Yeah, that's boring. Yeah.
But you know, I think this is a very interesting section, because we haven't looked at a lot of dialogue yet. So it was nice to go through a section that was about dialogue.
Yeah.
Oh,
well, sorry.
No, you can have a stretch. But I was about to say, well, on that note, like, thank you very much for going through this with me. Like, I really do appreciate it, because you take a lot of time out of your day to do this, Steve. So I do appreciate them.
No, it's fun. It's fun to look back and just sort of see the structural aspects, and how things are put, you know, how I put things together, basically, and remind myself that, oh yeah, I know how to do that. Sometimes I really need that reminding.
So thank you to Steve, and all that remains then is for me to say thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.
Bye-bye.